I am a 33-year-old female and have an older brother, a 37-year-old male who has been living with me for an entire year with his wife, a 35-year-old female and 3 kids. His oldest is 9, his middle child is 5, and his youngest is about 2 years old now. My brother had come to me a year back with his family because he had nowhere else to go since our parents had kicked him out. Back then, the story that he'd told me was that he and his family had been living with our parents because my brother had been trying to make ends meet as a bartender and didn't make enough money to be able to afford rent. His wife was a stay-at-home mother, so she couldn't help out either, so my parents had told them that they could live with them until my brother found something more stable. My brother was never a good student and had really bad grades in high school, so finding a college that he'd get accepted into was proving to be pretty tough for him. After a while, he just gave up trying and told us that he wanted to be a professional photographer. My parents agreed because he'd always had a knack for it and believed that he could realistically pursue that hobby of his in a professional capacity. They even invested in him and bought him a professional-grade camera. Nothing came out of it, unfortunately, and within a year he had changed his mind. Then he wanted to be a graphic designer, and wasted another year and then a painter. My parents continuously funded his passions, which would die out in a year or so because they could afford to since we belonged to a considerably affluent family. For the last couple of years, he'd settled for restaurant staff, where he'd recently been promoted from waiter to bartender, but since the income barely cut it when it came to his family, he was still relying on our parents to fund him. Our parents also funded my college education, and I graduated with a business degree, unlike my brother who never bothered to go to college. Our parents also paid for his wedding and continued to feed him, his wife, and 3 kids until a year ago, when they finally kicked him and his family out of their house and he landed on my doorstep. He told me that he'd been kicked out by our parents because he'd refused to give his youngest son up for adoption, which had struck me as odd because that was an absolutely ridiculous demand to make of someone, let alone your own son. He'd even shown me screenshots to prove it, where Mom had sent her prospective parents who'd be willing to adopt his son. The reason they wanted him to give up a child was because they believed that the cost of letting them stay here with them was getting way too high, and they needed to do something to cut costs. Their idea of cutting costs was to give up a child so they wouldn't have to bear the cost of that in the future as well. When my brother refused, they kicked him out because they didn't want them around uselessly anymore. This is what my brother told me the day he came to me, sobbing like never before. They had nowhere else to go because his wife's parents had already cut her off years ago when they got married, because my brother wasn't the kind of guy they approved of. Even after they got kicked out, she'd tried to contact them, but with no luck. So they'd come to me to ask for help, and he requested me to let him stay with me for a while until he'd saved enough to be able to get back on his feet. I agreed because I felt awful that this was happening to him, even though he'd always been financially irresponsible and never took life seriously. I thought that he'd learn eventually. I had my own opinions about him taking life so lightly even after marriage and kids, but as long as our parents were okay with it and funding him, I didn't think it was my place to say anything or try and intervene. So I never did, but once he'd been kicked out and came to live with me, I was very blunt with him and told him that this could not be a permanent arrangement and that the most I could let him live here was for a year and a half. After that I was planning to move anyway, but I didn't want him moving with me, so he had to save up and make something of himself within that period. He promised me that he'd do so, and that's why I agreed to let him stay with me. I had a reasonably big house and I'd travel a lot for work, so living at my place wasn't an issue for me for the most part. My brother and I had always been on good terms, so for me helping him out when he needed it was never a dilemma. I could afford it. I had the means to help him, so it never even occurred to be selfish and turn him away. I even cut my parents off after he showed me the chats of them insisting that he pick someone soon so they could give up his youngest, who was already 1 year old at the time. I thought that my parents were crazy for even demanding that he do that, and couldn't see them in the same light anymore, so I cut them off blindly without even trying to confirm the story, and that, I think, was my biggest mistake, which I'm always going to regret. While living with me, my brother continued working as a bartender, and even took up extra shifts, so I believed that he was becoming more sincere about life in general. But I'd asked him to start contributing to the bills a couple of months back, and he'd said that he still hadn't saved up enough to be able to do that and needed more time, which seemed off because he literally had nothing else to spend his money on. His older kids went to public school, I was covering his rent and other living expenses, and I'm sure diapers and baby formula wouldn't cost him his entire income if he was actually taking up extra shifts at work. Nevertheless, I decided to give him some more time, but then I forgot about it. Even up until recently, I'd been the one covering their expenses, but I didn't mind because I believed that he'd been looking for better opportunities as well, and by the time I would move out of this house, he'd be ready for it as well. The truth about everything only came out about a week ago, when I ran into our parents at a party. I was attending a friend's son's birthday party, and there I ran into my parents by coincidence because apparently my friend's parents were friends with my parents. We didn't know that earlier since we became friends at a work event and hadn't exactly discussed our parents. I also have a really common last name, so she must not have made that connection either. When I realized that they were there at the party, I tried to avoid them so I wouldn't have to go through an awkward conversation, but they cornered me somehow. I told them right away that I wasn't going to forgive them after what they asked of my brother, because it was simply not okay, so they didn't have to waste their breath to apologize. But instead, my father told me another version of the story and even showed me proof to back it up. So, apparently, my parents had asked him to start contributing to the expenses because they were getting old, and both of them were almost 60 now, so they weren't sure how long they'd be able to continue working. Both of them are practicing surgeons, but they're aging and won't be able to continue for long, so supporting their son and his family of 5 isn't feasible for them in the long run. My brother was the one who suggested the idea of adoption because apparently he'd never planned to have a third kid, and now he'd realized that he'd never be able to support this entire family on his own. My parents were against the idea and tried to get him to change his mind, but he didn't, and so they at least tried to make sure that if their grandson had to be adopted, they'd want him to be adopted by a family that they approved of, so the poor kid would have a better home and more prepared parents. That's the reason why they'd sent those texts to my brother, but he'd deleted all the other texts where my mom said that she still didn't think this was a good idea and had shown me only what he wanted me to see. My parents kicked him out only a couple of weeks later when they came home to see my brother interviewing a couple where the wife was very obviously not entirely sober. She reeked of booze, but her husband seemed oblivious to it, and so did my brother and his wife. As soon as my parents entered the living room, he hastily ended the meeting and told them that he'd get back to them later. When my dad asked him what that was all about, he refused to answer, but after some arguing he opened up and told him that the couple they'd just met were willing to pay a huge amount to adopt their son because the mother had a bit of an alcohol problem and had been rejected by several adoption agencies already, so this was their last resort. My parents obviously lost their cool at that because he was essentially selling his baby to a drunk mom just because he didn't want to work hard and earn more. That led to a huge fight that day, and my parents finally kicked him out because they just couldn't stand by and watch these things happen anymore. My parents had half a mind to call CPS, but didn't, out of fear that their grandkids would be taken away since nobody in our family would be willing to adopt them entirely. I was always too busy working, and my parents were getting old, so we couldn't just adopt them, but neither could we abandon them. They knew that he'd go to me next and had expected me to be in touch with them, so they knew that their grandkids would be all right, but instead, I cut them off without any warning. My dad had planned to call me and discuss the expenses with me, but he never got the opportunity to do so. It was only through a relative who's close to my brother that they found out that his family was safe and sound living with me. My dad told me that he'd wanted to speak to me several times, but I'd blocked them everywhere, and he didn't think it was fair for me to do that to them without even bothering to verify the truth. And I guess they were right. I was a huge idiot there. Once I got to know the truth, though, I decided to go back home instantly, because after all the lies that my brother had fed me, I wasn't going to just let him live with me for free anymore. So I, along with our parents, drove home that day and confronted him and his wife about all that they'd said. The second I stepped through that door with my parents, he knew he was screwed and immediately went into defensive mode. But it didn't help at all, because now I knew the truth, and my trust in him was absolutely gone. We got into a really massive fight right in front of his kids. And that's when his oldest son decided to intervene and charged right at me, then pushed me so hard that I almost fell over. He'd caught me off guard, and it also didn't help that the kid was tall for his age. We were all so shocked by what he did that we didn't even notice the pencil he had in his hand, which he then used to repeatedly stab me in my knee until the nib of it broke, while screaming at me that I wasn't allowed to fight with his dad. After a few seconds, his mother finally came to her senses and grabbed him to drag him away from me. But he was still kicking and screaming hysterically. I admire my nephew's boldness to stand up for his dad, but in that moment I saw red and instantly told my brother that he needed to get out and take his kids with him right away. He looked horrified and tried to persuade me to let him stay for at least that night. But I didn't agree and told him that if he didn't leave, then I'd call the police. I guess the idea of cops showing up scared him, and so he started packing his bags while his wife tried to calm her kids down. My parents watched them pack while I iced the spot where my nephew had attacked me. It wasn't bleeding, thankfully, but it had already started bruising at the time, and now, after almost a week, it's finally hurting a little less. My parents and I are finally on speaking terms again, and there's an unspoken agreement that we're not going to bring up how we didn't speak for the last year because of what my brother did. I've apologized to them already, and I think they're fine with it now. I don't know where my brother went that day, and I hadn't heard back from him until last night when he texted me, saying that his kids were now by themselves, thanks to my cruelty, and he'd had to leave them with his wife's parents so they'd be taken care of while he and his wife worked and looked for accommodation. I ignored that text because I knew that was not my fault at all. He'd screwed up, and now he had to pay the price for it. Then he sent me another text saying that his wife had convinced her parents to speak to her with great difficulty, but they'd put forth the condition that she could either leave her deadbeat husband, referring to my brother, and move back in with them, or they wouldn't take in their grandkids. So now my brother and his wife were facing a really tough call where they could either separate for their own good and their kids' future, or they could stay together and risk it all. My brother believes that me and our parents are the ones to blame for this because we're the ones who kicked him and his kids out to the street that day. He called me heartless for not even thinking of his kids, which is what ticked me off. So I reminded him that his son had literally attacked me physically at the time, which is why I took that step. And he said that a 9-year-old who's had a rough childhood isn't comparable to a 30-something woman, and I should have had more compassion because now all 3 of his kids are traumatized by what happened. So am I the a-hole for kicking my brother out along with his 3 kids after I learned that he'd been lying to me for an entire year and living with me without even paying rent? Update 1. Hi. So I know that all of us involved in this have made some really stupid decisions, and it's mostly been out of love for my brother, because he's always been the softer kid, unlike me, because I was always a fighter. My brother was my best friend growing up, so when he came to me asking for help, I just could not bring myself to refuse. The same was true for my parents as well, since they never could say no to my brother either. It was just something about the way he behaved, and we could never really put our finger on it. But I guess it was just textbook manipulation now that the rose-colored glasses have come off. It's never been easy to deal with my brother because, despite all his flaws, he was still family, and none of us could bring ourselves to just abandon him and tell him to sort things out for himself, even after marriage and 3 kids. Hell, I'd even cut my own parents off for his sake. Now it's a different story, of course, because now that we all know the truth, there's nothing much that we can do about him. We've all gone above and beyond in our attempts to help him live a good and honest life, but it's just pointless, because to lead a life like that, he has to be a good and honest man first, which he's proven that he isn't. It's been about 3 days since I made my original post, and I still haven't responded to his last text about how I should have at least let his kids stay with me. I told my parents about it recently, but they told me that he was almost 40 now and he could deal with his problems on his own from this point onwards, because we'd done all that we could to help him. But if he didn't want to be helped, then that really wasn't on us. His in-laws have the right idea about him, and they're doing exactly what we should have done to get him to fall back in line. Given him an ultimatum and made sure he stuck to his words instead of treating him like a namby-pamby baby all the damn time. We were all worried about the kids, but after what happened with his oldest son, I was shaken up because it just wasn't natural or okay for a literal child to be acting out like that. My parents also agree and think that it's best for them to handle their kids on their own now, and if that makes us cruel or selfish people, then we'll accept that verdict as well. We just cannot go on forgiving my brother for things he's not even sorry for. Update 2. 1 week has passed since the last update, and yesterday my brother's in-laws reached out to my parents recently and asked them if they'd like to continue to be a part of their grandkids' lives, and my parents of course said yes. I said no because while I do love my nephews, I wouldn't want to be a part of their lives after what happened. I don't care if people think I'm cruel for holding that incident against a bunch of kids. I just don't want anything to remind either them or me of that incident at all. We're all better off this way, and this is how it should have always been for me. I should have known where to draw the line instead of going above and beyond for my brother and his family. His in-laws are still sticking to that arrangement and are pressuring their daughter to leave my brother, but have had the decency to still take care of the kids in the meantime. I guess nobody can have a heart of steel when it comes to the kids, which is probably why my brother got away with so much the way he did. But he can't continue to use his children as a shield forever, and he should have known that. He texted me again last night, begging me to take his kids in for at least a while in case he fails to persuade his in-laws to let his wife stay with him. I feel bad, but like I already said right before this, I cannot take his kids in anymore, and neither do I wish to interact with them. I wish them the best and hope that they're safe and sound for the rest of their lives. But I don't want to be part of their life anymore. I explained this to him in my text, and he hasn't replied to that yet, but I don't blame him for it either. What is he even supposed to say to a text that essentially means that he shouldn't hold out any hope, at least as far as I'm concerned, because he's only going to be disappointed? Update 3. Hey everybody. I haven't been able to post an update for about 3 weeks, but believe me, I had really good reasons for it. I was busy at work, and in addition to that, my family drama had gone to crazy levels in the past couple of weeks. My brother's in-laws had threatened my sister-in-law to file for custody of their grandkids if she didn't divorce my brother, and they knew that it was a case they could win quite easily if it really came down to it, because of everything that had happened in the past. My parents also agreed with them on this, because it had become really clear to all of us that neither of them was fit to be parents. His wife was too much of a pushover to actually ever say anything and just went along with my brother no matter what he said. So I believed that it was not only a good idea but also absolutely necessary for them to go ahead with that divorce, or at least live separately for a while, because otherwise she'd just keep enabling him and he'd keep pushing her further down. There was a lot of fighting and drama that took place over the course of the last few weeks, and I heard about most of it from my parents. It had gotten to the point where my brother and his wife were actually planning to abandon their kids and run away, but his wife couldn't go through with it and ended up returning to her parents, because she couldn't just escape without knowing if her kids would be all right in the future. So after a lot of discussion among my parents, my brother and his wife and her parents, they agreed that it was best for them to separate for their own betterment. My brother is now only allowed to see his wife and kids once a week, and not for more than an hour or so, only when either his mother-in-law or his father-in-law are at home. So it's like an unofficial custody arrangement for now, but his wife, a grown adult, is also part of that arrangement. And that's what they have to agree to, because they have no other choice. It's sad, but at least they didn't have to end up divorced, and there's some hope for reconciliation if my brother is able to finally take his life seriously and make something of himself. Otherwise, he's just doomed, and so is his marriage. My parents are allowed to see their grandkids whenever they please because my brother's in-laws were very grateful that they'd taken such good care of their daughter and grandkids for so many years. They're a couple of years younger than my parents, so they're managing the responsibility of 3 kids well enough, along with their daughter, and my parents are happy that they get to visit their grandkids whenever they want to. So that's how things worked out for my sister-in-law and her family. Things didn't work out so well for our family, though. My brother ended up cutting us all off after his wife went back to living with her parents because he thinks this is all our fault. Which we all know it isn't, but he just needs somebody to blame at this point. He's still working as a bartender, as far as I know, but probably taking his job a lot more seriously now that he knows it's not just a hobby that he can choose to take lightly, but the future of his family is on his shoulders now for real. He has nobody else but himself to fall back on now, something that he should have realized literally ages ago but didn't. He's blocked me. And honestly, I couldn't care less about it because I tried my best to help him out for almost a year, but there's just no gratitude in him for what me and my parents did for him. All he wants to do is blame us for things that are actually his own fault at the end of the day. My parents are disappointed with how this turned out, but I don't really care. He's lucky that he still has the chance to turn things around in spite of all the crap that he's done. I don't know a single other person who's had this many chances to fix their life, so he'd better take this seriously now. My only regret at this point is that I spent so much time and put in so much effort in trying to make him a better guy and fix his life for him, but it all amounted to nothing in the end. I don't regret the money because I can always earn that back, and neither do I regret helping him and taking his family in because that's what I believe was the right thing to do at the time. Now, of course, things are different, but I guess I'll get over it all someday.